This is Georgia Focus, a public affairs presentation of this radio station and the Georgia News Network. For the next 30 minutes, we'll feature a discussion about an issue of importance and relevance to you and your neighbors across Georgia.
Welcome to Georgia Focus. I'm John Clark on the Georgia News Network. The physical connections to most American presidents are deeply rooted in the past and are unfamiliar. For example, one can no longer see George Washington's birthplace or William Henry Harrison's log cabin, but Plains, Georgia is different. When Jimmy Carter ran for and was eventually elected president, crowds started flocking to the sleepy southwest Georgia hamlet. Today, many of the sites in Plains have been preserved by the National Park Service. Robert Buccellato chronicles this incredible period of U.S. and Georgia history in his book Jimmy Carter in Plains. He joins us today.
I'm from Dawson, a short ways away from Plains. I was interested in your book because I can identify with it. I remember Plains as a really sleepy town, and then all of a sudden it exploded, and you'd go through there, and well, those of us from southwest Georgia were amazed. We would see car tags from up north, which we'd never seen. And we'd see people stopping on the side of the road to pick cotton and pull up peanuts. It was really amazing how this small farming community became an overnight sensation. Did you visit Plains during that period yourself?
Well, I was actually born exactly 10 years to the day that the Peanut Express left Plains for Washington. So that's I guess that's sort of the irony of this whole entire enterprise is that I don't have I guess you'd say an aesthetic or an association to this subject matter. And so that seems to be the uniform question that people ask me is, you're 29 years old, you're born and raised in Florida, everything you've written before has to do with Florida and the Florida governorship. Why are you attracted to this? And for a while I said it was because my grandfather was in the Florida House of Representatives during the 1970s, during this time period, and he actually created the state's solar energy legislation, and he got a big help doing it from the Carter White House. And also, while he was in office, Jimmy Carter was the only Democratic president, and my grandfather was a Democrat. So the only presidential mementos that they had around the house was Jimmy Carter. You'd see inaugural programs and all that stuff. But I think it's actually deeper as I become older, as, I'm now a father and a husband, and I'm, tottering to antiquity now that I'm turning 30. And
it only gets worse.
I can only imagine. But you start to appreciate the fact that this man has this tenacity to do anything, to achieve anything. And he has the ability to make things that seem so monumental, so impossible, seem not only possible, but probable with hard work and determination. So I think it's these evergreen qualities that attract me. The idea that this man in this community said, we are as good as our northern neighbor. We are as good as the Kennedys of the world, the McGoverns of the world, the Humphreys of the world. And even though we're outsiders, most Americans are outsiders. And together, we can achieve the impossible. We can bring America together. And one of the things that I was so attracted to this subject matter for so long, and one of the reasons why I wanted to make this book, was that people seem to forget, because Jimmy Carter was defeated in 1980, so he's a little bit glossed over. People kind of forget how much of a real honest-to-goodness phenomenon this campaign was, and the explosion of Plains was. This is a time period when most of the major cities in the country, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to attract strangers to come and spend money. And as all of this was going on, this small, tiny community was bringing in 10,000 people daily, and they didn't spend a dime. There was no concentrated effort to say, come to Plains. This was a migration, an example of American soul searching. And it's largely undocumented, but it is one of those odd phenomenons where you had hundreds of thousands of people over a 2-year period just move to be nearer to Plains, to see what was happening. It was one of the oddest acts of national curiosity of the 1970s. Yeah. And think it's incredibly fascinating.
I do too. Now that you mention that, that's a great angle to take on it, because looking back now, that really was from the time he, announced, "My name is Jimmy Carter, I'm running for president." Throughout his presidency, it was a boom.
Yeah.
When he left the White House, did the popularity of Plains diminish as quickly as it had begun, or was it a slow fade?
There's two sides to the story of Plains. There is the positive and there's the negative. And depending on who you talk to in Plains, depends on what kind of story you're going to hear. There's two photographers that have contributed to this book. One is a gentleman by the name of Charles Plant, who had unprecedented access to the Carters. And so he has a lot of great images, and he has a lot of personal images. The other individual is a man by the name of Eddie Hunter, and he was a amateur photographer. And the images he caught were after the election, and by then the excitement was gone. And not only was the excitement gone, but you have these images of Miss Lillian Carter, Billy Carter, and they're very standoffish. And to me, these images capture that flip side, that double-edged sword. The fact that this campaign was so much about winning the White House, that once they got the White House, they lost their hometown. So it was, to answer your question, it was a gradual decline as far as commerce was concerned, because everything, all the stores and everything went from this agro-business culture to this sort of Jimmy Chunk culture that they used to say. It just, everything went from mercantile to merchandise.
Right.
One person described it as this tourist, Shangri-La, this tourist fiefdom that just sort of popped up out of nowhere. But for a lot of the locals, like Billy Carter, for instance, he moved. He just left 6 months after the election. Things took a precipitous turn instantly. And a lot of locals became fed up, and they started living in Americus, which was 10 miles away, because it went from a situation where they could just get up in the morning and they could get some milk at downtown, and they could just be, in their pajamas, or, they didn't have to impress anybody because they knew everybody for so long, to now women couldn't leave the house without full hair and makeup because they were going to be on the evening news.
Yeah. And then they never came back, I guess, largely, did they?
A lot of them didn't. And that was one of the things that I mentioned in the book, is that most of Jimmy Carter's neighbors sold their houses right after he became president. And they were bought up by rich strangers who had never been to Plains, but they wanted to be able to say that they were neighbors to the new president.
That's like having a condo at the beach or something, almost.
Yeah. Then that's one of those, and one of the examples that I kind of related to was After Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. All of the squares in Savannah are now owned by rich people who are never there. Same thing in Venice. Most of the nice villas in Venice are owned by rich people that are only there 3-4 times a year. And if you go to Venice now, most of the streets are just dead because nobody's there. And that was the same thing. Plains, this small community, which was such a big part of their narrative, was this awakening, this return to rural living, saw this horrible communal decline almost instantly.
You mentioned the photographers. Your book it's filled with great photographs, and that's a large part of it, because not only do you write about the history and the captions on the photographs and all, but it's a great pictorial history of it. So the two photographers, your collaboration with them really came out right in your book, Jimmy Carter and Plains.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and Charles Plant's photos, particularly of election night and election morning, it's such an honor to have them in this book, because he was the only photographer that had permission to be on the train depot, on election night. Right. So his access to President-elect Carter as he was coming back to Plains, posterity wouldn't have that moment if it wasn't for Charles Plant, if it wasn't for him being there. And, I'm sure a lot of listeners don't remember this, but Jimmy Carter didn't win the actual presidency until after 3 a.m. when Mississippi went over to his column. So he didn't get back. He was in Atlanta at the time. He didn't get back to Plains to thank his hometown until sunrise the next morning. And so these images of him there's this wonderful, almost romantic quality about it because this beautiful golden pink sunshine is creeping over the shop corners of Main Street, and it's just shining everybody that's on the depot platform. And they're all asleep, or half asleep, they're all exhausted, everybody's crying, and it's this wonderful emotional moment in American history.
And there were throngs of people there. I know you have some pictures in the book of that. It's filled. You can't put anybody else in downtown Plains.
No, I mean, it was, it was one of those situations where they had to close down the town. You couldn't actually park in the town because it was just packed with people. Yeah. It was about 10,000 people that were there for about 48 hours. The pharmacist who had the local pharmacy there, which is parallel to the train depot, which was the campaign headquarters, he said he was up for 50 hours straight. They had these jumbo flat screen TVs that flat screen by 1976 perspective. I mean, they're probably about 30 inches or something. But they were broadcasting the election results. They had all of these open fires out on the street corner of Main Street to try and keep people warm. There were 3 or 4 bands playing all night long. Jimmy Carter was hanging out in Atlanta, but every other person named Carter was there in Plains partying.
Yeah. It's had a resurgence somewhat with the Carters still living there, and President Carter's Sunday school, well known for teaching the Sunday school class there.
And that's actually how the book ends. Is the last chapter is about this sort of parallel transition that both the community and Jimmy Carter make once he leaves the White House. And one of his greatest project in the latter part of his life has been to transform Plains into a national park. And you have this odd relationship between a president and a hometown, and they're both inseparable in a way. You can't really explain or describe Plains or Jimmy Carter without mentioning the other one. And his mission to promote his hometown has kind of created this sort of little enterprise within itself, with the fact that he does teach Sunday school once or twice a month. But there's also a local historic inn in Plains that was designed by Jimmy Carter. It was his idea, and he built most of the furniture. He has deeded his house to the Park Service. He was instrumental in making sure that his boyhood home became a part of the Park Service. He tried as hard as he could to make sure that Billy's old gas station was added into the national park, but because of, I guess, his brother's exploits and alcoholism and all that, it never really made it. But the city, Plains, has made sure that they take care of it, and it is a part of their own little tourism. And also, there is the high school in Plains, which is the visitor center. That cost about $6 million to renovate. A lot of people think that when they walk in there, that the school just one day closed and it was inherited to the Park Service.
Right.
But it actually laid vacant for a very, very long time. When Jimmy Carter was running for president, it was abandoned and it was partially dilapidated. It cost $6 million, like I said, to restore it, but the government, the federal government, only was willing to pay about $3 million. So the community of Plains had to come up with $3 million all on their own. And Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter, they were instrumental in coming up with that money. They, they donated signed books. They did speaking tours to donate money. John and Betty Pope, who are pretty well-known figures in Americus, they were instrumental in bringing about all this, and it was one of those great moments in Plains where you had once again a campaign to promote and preserve not only Jimmy Carter and the 1976 election, but the idea of Plains.
Have you had any reaction from President Carter, and what's been the reaction from the people of Plains?
Well, I can tell you that the people of Plains that I've spoken to, they have enjoyed the book. They've liked the book. They like my interest in Plains and my own willingness to help them in their goal to preserve and maintain the community. I have not heard anything from President Carter. I've talked to Phil Wise, who is a part of board of directors for the Carter Center, and he's very pleased about it. He actually contributed to a few interviews. He has told me that the Carters are aware of it, and they are glad that I wrote the book, which is good. But, he, I think, has probably been affected more by his battle for cancer than people realize. And he has retired from the Carter Center for the most part. I think he is starting to withdraw a little bit. I think if it was a situation where if I wanted him to endorse the book or something like that, I think I probably wrote it about 15 years too late. I don't think he's in that sort of avenue anymore. I do know that Walter Mondale has read it, and he liked it. I know Betty Pope, who wrote a very nice little book blurb for me, was very happy about it. But yeah, I do hope that anyone who is interested in planes or associated with planes would feel that the book is a part of them and that they have a piece of the book, because it was my love letter to them.
That's Robert Buccellato, author of the book Jimmy Carter in Planes. Last year, President Carter issued a book of his own about his life. Planes was prominently featured in the book, and last year I spoke with President Carter about that.
In the book, A Full Life, you talk a great deal about growing up in planes and then returning there after the Navy and of course still living there today. And those of us who grew up in rural Georgia can identify with that lifestyle, but rural Georgia seems to be changing so much. It's almost sad to see some of the small towns dry up.
Well, that's true. Plains is doing well because Rosa and I live there, and we kind of keep it going. But if you get to Sassa and Brownwood and so forth, and Leary around there, it's going downhill kind of. Dawson's holding its own pretty well, I think.
It is in some of the towns, but people moving away to the bigger cities now. And
yeah, I know.
You talk about in the book your boyhood home and the shops on the farm and so forth. Those are still standing today?
Yes, they are. You need to come by and take a look.
I'd love to. What about the haunted house? The story of the haunted house is interesting in the book. Is that still around?
It's still there. We preserved it. Rosa and I kind of raised some money and put a new roof on it and fixed it up. But it's just the same configuration and all that it was when we lived in it for 5 years.
You say in the book that when you decided to leave the Navy, you didn't let Mrs. Carter know at first, and she wasn't very thrilled with that idea.
That's putting it mildly. No, she was angry with me for about a year after that. And Rosa was very strong-willed. She didn't exhibit her strong will much, up until that time, but she was running our family and she was taking care of the finances and all while I was at sea most of the time. And so I felt that I should just assume the same status that my father and other men that I knew, make the basic decisions and expect your wife to go along with them once they were made. And she really was upset. I think perhaps more than anything else I ever did, peremptorily without consulting her when I got out of the Navy.
And then you mentioned, too, the same thing when you first started running for Senate, I thought it was funny she thought you were dressing for a funeral.
Well, that's true. Well, I went in to take off my khaki clothes or blue jeans and put on a coat and tie, and she said, Jimmy, are you going to a funeral? And I said, no, I'm going to qualify to run for the state Senate. And that's the first time she'd ever heard about it.
Mr. President, it's certainly a pleasure to talk to you, and your book is a wonderful read. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Well, come to see me.
That's President Jimmy Carter. The Jimmy Carter National Historic Site, located in Plains and managed by the National Park Service, preserves sites associated with President Carter, including his boyhood home, school, and the town railroad depot, which served as his campaign headquarters during the 1976 campaign. Barbara Judy is superintendent of the Jimmy Carter National Historic Site. Barbara, what will visitors see when they visit the Jimmy Carter National Historic Site?
We have 3 sites that are open to the public, and the first one that most visitors see when they come into town is the Plains Depot. And that's the location where Jimmy Carter mounted his successful 1976 presidential campaign. I think it's very interesting for visitors to see that very simple rustic building and think about a successful presidential campaign being operated out of that location. The second location that people tend to find is Plains High School. It's called a high school, but it actually supported grades 1 through 11, and President Carter and Ms. Rosalynn both attended all of their schooling there until they went on to college. That is the park's main visitor center and contains a number of exhibits that cover President Carter's life in a chronological fashion, and also some stories from the life of First Lady Rosalynn Carter. A third site, and one really not to be missed, it's about 2.5 miles from Plains High School, and that is the Jimmy Carter Boyhood Home. That's a farm located in the community of Archery. Archery is an unincorporated community sort of on the edge of Sumter County and Webster County. And we have 17 acres of the original 300-plus acre farm, an exhibit farm. People can walk around and see the buildings that were the center of the farm when Jimmy Carter was growing up there, see some of the livestock and crops that were produced at that farm, visit the commissary where Jimmy Carter's dad, Earl Carter, operated a store that supported the local community, and learn a lot about the early childhood years in a very poor part of the world where a community really had to hold together in order to support one another, and see how that shaped his character.
Some of these places, I know in the case of Plains High School, for example, it was in quite a bit of disrepair, I guess, when you guys took it over.
It was. That was in right about 1990, and there was a rehabilitation campaign that carried on until about 1994. The building's in really good shape now. The most common thing that people say when they walk in the building is, this is a really nice building.
How about the Boyhood Home? Who owned that? Did the Carter family still own that before the Park Service took it over?
So the Carter family, Mr. Earl and Miss Lillian, they sold that property in the late 1940s, and then Mr. Earl was in the process of transitioning his business to be sort of a middleman in the peanut production industry. So they moved into Plains proper at that time. And it was sold to another family who still owned it in the 1990s when the National Park Service was beginning to establish its site. And so they sold it to the National Park Service. Again, they sold us about 17 acres out of the original 300 that made up the farm.
The old train depot, I remember going in that as a kid, and that doesn't seem to have changed at all over the years. It seems to be very much like it always has been, and certainly when it was there, it was the campaign headquarters.
I think that's true. It's really managed by the park as an exact expression of what things looked like during the campaign. So it is definitely a time capsule. Billy
Carter's gas station has also been revitalized, but now that's not part of the National Park Service, right? That's a local museum.
That's right. It's managed by the Plains Better Hometown. Billy Carter service station is directly across the street from the train depot. It's easy to visit. It's open, generally speaking, on a drop-in basis during the day, and visitors might very well enjoy that. You know, there's an interesting connection between that site and the Jimmy Carter story, which is basically that media, as they were trying to figure out who this upstart politician was from South Georgia, that is where they hung out and met local people and began to understand a little bit more about where Jimmy Carter came from and what was motivating him to mount this presidential campaign. So there's definitely a strong connection between the two sites in terms of the Jimmy Carter story.
President and Mrs. Carter live on the outskirts of Plains. I guess it's right in the Plains on the highway to Richland, and their home is there. That's not part of the site, is it?
It's part of the site, but it's close to the public while the Lifetime Estate is in place. At some point, we imagine that it will be open to the public, and the stories that can be told there have to do with leaders from all over the world who have come to that location in order to confer with President and Mrs. Carter and make very sweeping decisions. Examples being Mr. Sadat of Egypt and many, many others.
Do you give daily tours of the site?
We do. Our depot and Plains High School are self-guided. At Plains High School, you will encounter very friendly rangers who will be happy to explain anything about the stories that are told within the park. Out at the Boyhood Home, we have scheduled tours, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And if a group arrives, or if a group is planning to come to the park, they can call, let's say, a week in advance and arrange for a time for a tour that would fit their group.
The visitor center is also a museum, so there are a lot of artifacts in there and things like that as well.
That's right. For example, one thing that our visitors really love to see is we have one of the bronze peace medals. You know, there are 3 medals given for a recipient of a Nobel Peace Prize, 2 bronze ones and 1 gold one, so we have one of the bronze ones on display. Another thing our visitors really enjoy, we have a replica in the Plains High School of the desk that President Carter used during his time in office. We encourage people to sit down and imagine themselves being the president, and our visitors really enjoy that experience.
Talking about where you're located and when you're open.
We are open 7 days a week, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. We just have 3 holidays a year. That'd be Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's Day. We are on Highway 280. That will lead you, whether you're coming from the east or the west, that'll lead you right through the middle of Plains. And once you get to Plains, Plains is really a village of about 700 people. We are incredibly easy to find. Anybody who feels at all confused can stop and talk to somebody. People here are very friendly and be happy to help out any visitor who comes to town.
That's Barbara Judy, Superintendent of the Jimmy Carter National Historic Site. Thanks to our guests on today's program, President Carter, Barbara Judy, and Robert Buccellato, author of the book Jimmy Carter in Plains. And thanks to you for listening. We'll talk to you next week on Georgia Focus.
You've been listening to Georgia Focus, a public affairs presentation of this station and the Georgia News Network. The views expressed on this program are not necessarily those of the staff, management, or ownership of this station or the Georgia News Network. If you have comments or questions about Georgia Focus, contact John Clark at the Georgia News Network at 1-800-776-4638 or email johnclark@georgianewsnetwork.com. Thanks for listening.